Welcome to course ALC 445, Following Procedures, Rationalizations. The AMT Awards program is designed to provide individual mechanics and maintenance organizations with human factors and safety systems information. Since 2009, the AMT core courses have carried a common thread called Failure to Follow Procedures. We are altering this theme to make it a more positive experience for the learner. However, because it seems that in nearly every accident and incident scenario investigated by the FAA and NTSB have conditions and circumstances where maintenance policies, procedures, rules, instructions, regulations, and/or best practices have intentionally been disregarded. These courses are intended to provide you with information about why this occurs and tools you could use to prevent a failure to follow procedure in your workplace.
The most popular safety tool that we offer is the Maintenance Minimums Checklist. This was recently reprinted and is available through your local FAST Team Program Manager. Other safety nets that we have presented in the past include the Human Factors Dirty Dozen concept, the Mechanics Creed and the Maintenance Manager's Creed, the PAIR concept, the PAWS concept, and the Safety Begins with Zero Violations concept. We continue to offer many free online courses through our Aviation Learning Center, ALC, located on our www.faasafety.gov website. You are encouraged to access and use these tools often. This course will provide you with an understanding about why policies, procedures, instructions, rules, regulations, and best practices exist, and why they are considered to be the safety net foundation. Then the course will discuss the difference between an unintentional noncompliance and a deliberate intentional violation. We'll discuss how deviations from these critical safety nets create unacceptable and unsafe conditions. Then the course will introduce you to the 5 most common rationalizations that mechanics use to justify when they intentionally deviate from established safety nets. Finally, the course will provide you with examples when you might find yourself in the rationalization mode, and recommend some alternatives when you do find yourself having to make the compliance versus intentional noncompliance decision. Here we go. Let's begin by looking at a few statistics that lead us to believe that failure to follow procedures is an issue.
What everyone knows is that mechanics do not come to work with the intent to disregard policies, rules, procedures, instructions, regulations, and/or best practices. Instead, we know that aviation mechanics are extremely conscientious, highly skilled, and well-meaning when it comes to compliance with policies, procedures, and rules. The fact that only 12% of aviation incidents and accidents are maintenance-related is a testimonial to this notion. However, of that 12% of total general aviation accidents, over 90% of them are fatal. This is not acceptable.
It is also of statistical significance that when maintenance-related accidents are investigated, 3/4 of them include not following procedures.
Clearly, failure to follow maintenance policies, procedures, instructions, rules, regulations, or best practices must be avoided. While unintentional deviations from procedures cannot be avoided, intentional deviations can be avoided in all cases. It is simply a decision by the organization and individual maintenance technician to never intentionally deviate from known policies, procedures, instructions, and/or best practices. In recent years, the NTSB factual reports have included in their recommendations the need for improved organizational safety culture, more attention to maintenance details, and more willingness to comply with maintenance policies and procedures. We know that the NTSB reports often list the causes of the incident or accident as being pilot-related when, in fact, there were some maintenance issues listed as contributing factors.
Take a minute now to read a few of these NTSB accident reports and see if you can detect where better compliance with maintenance safety nets might have avoided them. This brings us to a pivotal question. Given that aviation mechanics are familiar with the dirty dozen human factors, and they are conscientious about safety while they do their maintenance tasks, why is it that the FAA and NTSB accident investigators continue to find contributing factors where maintenance policies, procedures, instructions, rules, regulations, and best practices were apparently disregarded? It is impossible to know exactly what a mechanic is thinking when he or she makes the intentional choice not to follow procedures. Each instance of maintenance procedure noncompliance is unique, and the individual mechanic must make that choice while considering a multitude of organizational pressures, peer pressures, and personal pressures. In the end, the choice is solely made by the individual mechanic, you. In the majority of cases, when a mechanic elects not to comply with policies, procedures, instructions, rules, regulations, and/or best practices, there is no negative outcome. Our aviation maintenance system is so robust that if an aircraft is dispatched with a procedure not complied with, the non-compliance condition is almost immediately forgotten, and there's almost never an accident associated with that behavior. In fact, if there was a high level of organizational and/or peer pressure that encouraged the mechanic to commit the non-compliance failure to follow procedure, the organization and/or peer group might give accolades to the mechanic for making the decision to do what was necessary to keep the fleet flying. This is called tacit approval and is the number one impetus for the unsafe human factor known as norms. When those times occur and the outcome is favorable, everyone rejoices and gives the mechanic kudos for being slick and company-oriented. In fact, the company and colleagues may even give tacit approval in the form of extra recognition or even a bonus. But when those bend-the-rules times result in a disastrous outcome, everyone, including the company, peers, and regulators, wonder what it was that allowed the mechanic to think an intentional deviation would be acceptable. Even if it initially appears that failing to follow procedures was all right this time, a failed maintenance procedure, whether it is intentional or unintentional, potentially sets up an unsafe condition that could result in an accident hours, days, weeks, months, even years down the road. These are called latent failure accidents because they are associated with failures just waiting to happen. All they need is just the right trigger to become a disaster reality. Human factors scientists have identified 5 hazardous, unsafe attitudes for pilots. Those attitudes are impulsivity, anti-authority, invulnerability, macho, and resignation. These same hazardous, unsafe attitudes can also directly apply to the aviation mechanic. Now, let's introduce a corollary to the 5 unsafe pilot attitudes. The 5 most common rationalizations that aviation mechanics use in order to justify intentional deviation from known policies, procedures, instructions, rules, regulations, and/or best practices. If you read these definitions carefully, you'll quickly realize that they closely follow some of the unsafe attitudes for pilots and many of the dirty dozen human factors that are common for aviation maintenance technicians. If you're not familiar with the dirty dozen human factors, please feel free to take the FAST Team online course titled Dirty Dozen Human Errors in Aviation Maintenance, ALC 107. The Dirty Dozen Maintenance Human Factors are also covered in the 2014 online AMT Awards core course titled Human Factors Primer for Aviation Mechanics, ALC 258. The FAA General Handbook Addendum Chapter 14, Human Factors, which is available on the www.faasafety.gov website, also discusses maintenance human factors. Okay, here's what we mean by safety, policies, procedures, instructions, rules, regulations, and best practices. It is important to know what we mean when we use these terms. It is also important to know where they come from and why they are the cornerstone to safety. To begin, here's the official definition of the word safety in accordance with the ICAO document 9859. And here is the same definition reduced down to a simple sentence. Notice that the key elements to safety are acceptable risk level and established safety controls. Of course, there'll always be risk in aviation. The idea is to reduce risk levels to where they are acceptable to the organization or system that is affected. Established safety controls are the mechanisms put in place in order to maintain risk levels in the acceptable range. This is why documented policies, procedures, instructions, rules, regulations, and best practices exist in the first place. They establish and maintain the overall level of acceptable risk and protect against known unsafe conditions caused by human factors. Any risk level above acceptable is therefore unacceptable and considered unsafe. This is why it's important to never intentionally deviate from known and documented policies, procedures, instructions, rules, regulations, or best practices. When we use the term policies, we're referring to a system or organizational strategy that includes a set of normal or expected actions that conform with agreed-upon ideals that help to establish acceptable safety risk levels. A company, maybe your company, might have a stated policy like this. XXX Airlines will always maintain the highest level of safety. You would probably find this in the company's operations manual, in the stockholder literature, or in the company mission statement. Of course, there are other policies that are written to help protect the organization, like the policy on pay raises, overtime, how you should dress while in the shop, the quality of the tools you're expected to have, and so on. A policy that a mechanic will maintain calibration of personal tools might be a policy designed to help the company and the mechanic to be in compliance with regulations concerning tool calibration. Then there are the policies that are designed to protect the individual, like the requirement to wear a harness when there's a potential to fall from a high place. You may even have some policies of your own. For instance, you might have a policy about to whom and how often you will loan your personal tools. The term procedures refers to the published methods a mechanic is required to use while performing his or her duties and responsibilities. Procedures are typically published in company manuals, maintenance manuals, vendor manuals, and so on. This type of procedure is usually written by people who have a broad and intimate knowledge about the system as a whole. Procedures are written in order to ensure that the outcome of a maintenance task will be safe, repeatable, and predictable. Procedures ensure that every time a certain maintenance task is performed, it will be done the same way. There are also procedures for how to accomplish certain company requirements. These would be found in the company's General Operating Manual, GOM, or the company's General Maintenance Manual, GMM. The term instructions refers to very specific steps that are required in order to perform a procedure. Using tool calibration as an example, a maintenance organization might have a policy that all mechanics will have their personal tools that require calibration to be calibrated within the required calibration date. This policy will need to have a follow-on procedure and instructions that mechanics will use to ensure the company policy is being followed. For instance, the mechanic will present any tools that require calibration to the tool room attendant for calibration within 5 working days of calibration expiration. Instructions for continued airworthiness, ICA, are included in the execution of the FAA Form 337 and provide specific steps needed to maintain a major repair or major alteration on an aircraft in airworthy condition. Another example of instructions is when you're filling out a form. There are usually instructions about how to fill out a particularly complicated form, like the IRS tax forms. The FAA has instructions about how to complete application forms and other airworthiness-related forms. Rules are common standard practices that support the mechanic to properly follow instructions. Rules often exist within the maintainer's head, put there through training and experience, or they can be written down in manuals and standard operating procedures. Sizing of a bolt, for instance, is a common knowledge rule. Rules are a quick way to recall common knowledge regarding the proper way something should be accomplished or should be. For example, when driving a rivet, the rules for deciding if the rivet is properly driven would be: the head is flat and parallel with the material, and the diameter of the shop head is 1 1/2 times the diameter of the shank. How about the drill size that should be used for a 1/8 inch rivet? A mechanic who does sheet metal work would know the common rule to use:
a number 30 drill bit.
Sometimes a mechanic will misapply a rule to a given situation, or sometimes a rule in a mechanic's head is simply incorrect, or maybe an unsafe habit. Times like this are called rule-based errors, and rule-based errors are often not discovered until there is an accident or an incident investigation. For instance, maybe the mechanic mistakenly remembers, and then in his mind properly applies, the rule: the shop head diameter should be twice the diameter of the rivet shank in a well-driven rivet. This would be a rule-based error. Rule-based errors are often caused by the human condition. They are commonly referred to as mistakes. Regulations are established laws of the land. They are written and enforced so that there is a baseline of a minimum acceptable level of safety risk for all combined communities and/or organizations. Regulations would include any state laws, regional laws, city laws, or local laws. They are established safety controls that include not only the FAA regulations, but also include safety regulations written and enforced by OSHA, for instance. One purpose, among others, for FAA regulations is to best promote the development and safe use of the national airspace. Remember that regulations set the overall minimum acceptable level of risk for the community as a whole. In our case, it's the general aviation community associated with aviation maintenance, the maintenance workers, the maintenance organizations, the aircraft, and most important, the people who ride in and operate the aircraft we maintain. It goes without saying that many regulations are written after an accident or incident has occurred and an unsafe condition has been discovered that has an associated unacceptable level of risk. Those blood-borne regulations are mitigation strategies to ensure that an accident or incident caused by that particular unsafe condition will not reoccur. The laws and regulations are mitigation strategies that are meant to lower the overall safety risk of the community to acceptable levels. Best practices are not regulations. Instead, they are recommendations for acceptable ways to comply with regulations. Advisory circulars are a good example of best practices. They are written to provide suggested, acceptable ways that an organization or individual can accomplish compliance. Understandably, regulations are often written so that there can be multiple ways of compliance. When there are multiple ways to comply with a regulation, or when the regulation is written in a manner that it is difficult to understand, advisory circulars and other similar publications can be used as best practice guidance. Of course, the FAA does not have a corner on all of the best practices. There are many industry groups and organizations that review and publish their own versions of best practices. For instance, manufacturer safety bulletins, service letters, and safety recommendations are examples of industry-driven best practices. Best practices can apply to all of the established safety controls we've discussed. When selecting a best practice to follow, it is important to pay close attention to the source and intent of the best practice. Always double-check to be sure that the best practices you use do not conflict with established safety controls. Here's a quick revisit to the meaning of a couple of terms we've been using throughout this course so far. The term unintentional noncompliance refers to a deviation to safety nets and safety controls as the result of a human condition. These deviations are caused by human factors. Unintentional noncompliance happens simply because we are human. Human errors and mistakes cannot be avoided. Safety nets and safety controls are designed to trap unintentional errors. The entire purpose for the existence of safety controls is to be the checks and balances for failures of the human condition that cause us to make unintentional errors. Intentional deviations from the safety nets and safety controls is by definition a conscious effort. Intentional deviations are violations. Human factors that cause us to make mistakes do not cause this behavior. Intentional deviations occur because someone has rationalized that it will be all right to intentionally not follow procedures. Remember, both unintentional and intentional deviations will compromise safety margins. The only difference is that intentional deviations can totally be avoided. If we eliminate all intentional failure to follow procedures, we can and will improve maintenance safety margins. So here it is in a nutshell. All policies, procedures, instructions, rules, regulations, and best practices combine with one another to ensure that when we do our work, we can be certain that the total safety risk level remains in the acceptable range. We call these established safety controls the safety nets. When safety nets are disregarded or not followed, whether it is unintentional or intentional, the level of safety risk automatically increases above the acceptable level, and hence, safety is compromised. Because we are human, it is impossible to totally eliminate the unintentional errors. Unintentional errors are mistakes, and it is very difficult to know when they occur. That's why we use checklists and a second pair of eyes as mitigation strategies to catch our mistakes. However, intentional deviations are violations by definition, and they can be avoided. Recognizing when we are in the rationalization mode is a great way to know when we are about to make a critical decision regarding the choice to intentionally commit a deviation from a documented safety net. When we are able to recognize the times we are in the rationalization mode, we can consciously choose to either intentionally follow procedures or fail to follow procedures. Safety requires that we always intentionally choose to follow all procedures. The safety nets. So here's the big question. Given that policies, procedures, instructions, rules, regulations, and best practices are the safety controls that set the acceptable risk level for our aviation maintenance industry, when is it ever acceptable to intentionally deviate from them? The only answer is never.